Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our main hall. We hope you had enough time to enjoy the meal. Now we will start our second keynote policy dialogue. This session will be opened by His Excellency Dr. Febrio Kacaribu, Head of the Fiscal Policy Agency of the Republic of Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, please warmly welcome Dr. Febrio Kacaribu. Naik ke atas podium ya Pak ya.
Good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So glad to be here among my seniors and my fellow academia and fellow researchers. It is always feeling like going back home for me. I'm Febrio Kacaribu. I'm the Chief of the Fiscal Policy Agency at Ministry of Finance, Republic of Indonesia. I'm policy maker, basically. So, but before taking this position as a policy maker, I'm still teaching at University of Indonesia with Dean Teguh Dartanto as my boss. So I'm so lucky that he's allowing me to claim that I'm still a teacher. Although in the last 2 semesters, I guess I was always declining his appointment of teaching, so I'm so sorry, because we're dealing with COVID, by the way. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, so happy to be here, and I would like to share slightly our perspectives on fiscal policies in supporting poverty reduction during the pandemic. So this is clearly very close to our hearts. Very close to our experience as well. All of you coming from many different countries, many different situations, but you are clearly watching this very closely as part of your interest for policy research and also part of your passion, I suppose, I hope. Please allow me slightly to give us just a preview of what the economy of Indonesia has been experiencing, especially the last several months of economy. I would like just to give you how we see this COVID pandemic. Much better compared to 2020, clearly. 2021 was also better, even though we were facing Delta. But now we are facing Omicron, slightly or substantially much lower intensity compared to 2020 and 2021. Clearly, this is a very important story because what we have faced in the last 2 years, 2.5 years, clearly have significant impact to our policies, our achievement in terms of poverty reduction in Indonesia. And also, I think you could see these similarities with what many other countries, especially developing countries, actually facing during the pandemic. So I would like to just briefly give us a context as to we're still facing this big risk macroeconomically. We are still facing uncertainty in the global market. Now, even maybe bigger than ever, we are facing a commodity price crisis. We are also facing a food security crisis. So clearly this is very directly impacting our policy and our achievement in trying to reach poverty reduction. Globally, IMF just released last night, our time, that the economic growth of global for 2022 is now also corrected again. I forgot the number, but it is quite significantly, and also next year. That means that not only that we're facing uncertainty and challenges this year in Indonesia and also globally, we are also still going to be facing the same challenges next year with a lot of uncertainties. Geopolitics clearly has caused a lot of disruptions in terms of supply side, but also now we are experiencing some uncertainties in terms of the prices for energy and food. So if you could put the slide on, number 6. This is what we are facing now. In terms of the energy, we have the price of natural gas, coal, and crude oil still at record high, somewhere around a record high. In terms of the food price, we had big challenges up to at least last month. At least now we see some improvement in terms of the prices of wheat, price of soybean, corn, etc. Developing countries, Indonesia and Southeast Asia in particular, we kind of have this relief as to the production of rice in the last 2 or 3 years has been surplus. So that's giving us a little bit of relief, because otherwise that could actually eat into our inflation substantially, because countries like Indonesia and Southeast Asia countries, as you are all aware, we rely on a staple food mostly from rice. Next slide. This is again indicators of inflation, affordability of goods and services all over the world, and mainly you can see that in many parts of the world, both developing and also developed countries, we are all facing a crisis of inflation. In several countries, next slide, several countries, especially the developed economies, some of them already responded with policy rate increase, but the biggest economies like US and Europe are about to respond with a policy rate. What does it mean for us? That means that this is going to add a lot more uncertainty to the macroeconomic policy setting. Why? Because as a result of this increase in policy rates, what's going to happen is capital flow is going to return back to developed economies, and that also creating uncertainty in terms of exchange rate and further jeopardize our inflation management, especially in many countries like developing countries. Now, clearly not all countries are the same. Several countries are able to manage this better compared to the other. Indonesia, on one hand, is quite blessed because of the commodity prices. We are able to capitalize on those commodity prices and collect a lot more revenue this year compared to last year. Just to give you perspective, what we have done so far is to use majority of those windfall revenue from our commodity prices and direct it directly to help the purchasing power of our society. Just to give you a clear example, we don't increase the price of gasoline, huge subsidy now. We don't increase the price, the tariff of electricity, also huge subsidy as a result. And we don't change the price of cooking gas, LPG, also huge subsidy now. So historically, we are allocating about 100 trillion rupiah, so that will be about, 8 to 9 billion US dollars per year for subsidy of our energy. This year, this is now about 500 trillion rupiah. How much is that in terms of US dollars? About 30 billion US dollars. So that's a lot of resources that we gain from windfall, clearly, but we don't have much choices, but we would like to manage the purchasing power of our society. As a result, our poverty rate not going up but going down, because the index for the purchasing power is kept manageable. Not many countries have this luxury, clearly. Not many countries have the windfall revenue from the commodities. As a result, many countries are actually facing the crisis of malnutrition, because they are not only that they're struggling to find supplies for food and energy, but they don't in many countries, they also don't have enough reserves. They don't have a foreign reserve to buy those products because the price is going up and the supply is quite limited internationally. So again, not all countries are the same. We're trying to manage. In G20, what we're trying to do as a presidency of G20 is to collaborate with many countries, especially those who are fortunate enough to get the windfall from these commodities, like Saudi. Saudi and Indonesia actually initiated a high-level seminar on food insecurity. Several months ago, and back to last year, we actually managed to collaborate between finance ministers and health ministers in forming this so-called financial intermediary fund for health. That was a good, very big initiative started from Italy, a presidency. We talk about the global preparedness for future pandemics. So we collaborate and gather a lot of resources. So far, we're getting about $1.4 billion as to form this FIF at the World Bank, and this will continue to grow support for WHO program for global pandemic, future pandemic. Now, similarly, what we're trying to do now is to collaborate between finance ministers and agricultural ministers, or maybe other ministers connected to this story of the food insecurity. So we're gonna try, after the success that we had last July, 2 weeks ago in Bali, we managed to gather high-level seminars among developed economies and also developing economies to talk about food insecurity, clearly not only in G20 countries, mostly actually in poor countries, highly indebted countries. So hopefully this is going to continue into a more concrete ideas and concrete collaboration as to providing, again, collaborating resources to help a lot of countries actually now struggling in terms of food insecurity. Now, next slide, just to give you again, perspective as to how we manage our inflation. Our inflation is quite manageable so far compared to many other countries, but the main sources of our inflation coming from the food. And our food, beverage, and tobacco is actually about 25% of our, what do you call that? The price index for our consumer price index. So as you can see, although we managed to hold it quite stable, we are now facing 4.4 inflation based on last month data. We are expecting that this price should be manageable for the next several months up to the end of the year. We are targeting about 4.5% of inflation till the end of the year. I know not many countries can say that. A lot of countries actually saying that if you could manage the inflation in single digit, that is already a good achievement, like I showed you in several slides before. Now, next slide, just to give you perspective again as how Indonesian economy has evolved in the last several quarters. Back in 2020, clearly we had the biggest contraction, but again, compared to many other countries, the contraction in total was about only 2.1% year-on-year overall in 1 year. In 2021, we had a good recovery, good rebound. If it wasn't because of Delta variant, we could have achieved 5% growth, but because of the Delta variant predominantly, we achieved 3.7% growth rate last year. Now this year, we are in the midst of a lot of uncertainties that we are still facing. We're not gonna count all of our eggs before they hatch, clearly, but so far so good. In the first quarter, we had 5%. In the second quarter, the data is going to be announced next week. We are still expecting above 5% growth rate as well. And overall, in 2022, we are expecting about 5.1, 5.2 growth rate for our GDP. Next. This is very close and very dear to our heart. Anytime we're talking about economic growth, it is not a good quality without making sure that the poverty and unemployment to be still checked. We accepted the risk, we accepted the fact that during 2020 COVID, we had a jump in terms of our poverty rate, we had a jump in terms of unemployment rate. But since then, in 2021, because we know we are going to get this recovery and rebound of economy, we are trying to make sure always that our economic growth will be always accompanied by the recovery in terms of the unemployment and recovery in terms of the poverty as well. That's the least that we could achieve. I.e., a lot of us will be really care about this, but me personally, from the policymaker's perspective, that's the least that we could achieve. Why? Because we know we could have done better. So the least that we could do is just to make sure that the number of poor people not going to increase further, number of people unemployed not to increase further, but going down. So that's the least that we should achieve. Better yet, what we would like to do is more than that, clearly. So if we go further, I will skip slide 13, go to, of course, this is our aspiration to be a developed economy by 2045. Go to next slide. This is what we always see. Next slide, please. We see our Human Development Index, how we see not only that the quality of our economic growth has to be shown at least by the poverty rate is getting better, the unemployment rate getting better, but also we look at the indicators of the Human Development Index, infant mortality rate, illiteracy rate, electrification, education, health, living standard, clearly. Next slide. We are looking at our budget from central government also to local government. By the way, out of our 100% government budget total, central government budget, about a third of those actually goes to the transfer to the regional government. So now it is about 700 to 800 trillion rupiah every single year. So it is quite a challenge for us, and actually really, we need to challenge the government ourselves, how to make sure that when you spend that much money to the region, making sure that the theme of the spending is actually well maintained and well coordinated. The logic of our spending need to focus on, one is human capital, clearly. The second one is clearly the physical capital when you build infrastructure, roads, etc. But of course, the third story will be about our bureaucracy. Is it getting better or not? Now, in terms of the human capital, we are making sure that our health system is getting better. We had a lot of big lessons coming from the last 2 years. How capacity of our health system so inadequate, and compared to if we could have had better, that will make a big difference actually. How we found out that to vaccinate people is not really as easy as jabbing people. You actually need people who are able to give jabs. And funnily, we don't really have enough people to give jabs. So we employ our military and policemen to do the jobs. So that's how our health system needs to improve a lot more, hopefully for the next time around, not fingers crossed, but hopefully for the next time around, we are much better prepared for that. That's for health, but now we're also looking at our primary healthcare facilities up to the level of the village. We've been doing that, and we would like to improve that further. That's the first theme, health. The second theme in human capital clearly is about education, making sure that 20% of our budget, it always goes for the education. But the question is, are we actually doing it, spending it wisely, spending it effectively? So that's always the challenge that we're facing. So if you look at, for example, the middle picture there, just to give you a perspective, local government versus central government, see that the majority of our spending for education is actually going to teachers, not a lot to go to the students itself. So these are a lot of reform that we need to do. Next, currently we are clearly facing a lot of opportunities, but also at the same time this is going to be a challenge. Are we going to be able to take advantage of our opportunities in terms of demography? We have still young population. We don't want to go to aging population before we actually can grow to the max that we are able to do. Trend of urbanization, that's going to have clearly challenge for us in terms of food security and inequality as well. Growing middle income for infrastructure to always keep up with that. skill adequacy in terms of how we maximize our potential during the young generation period, making sure that we are able to achieve that long-term medium goal in 2045 to be developed economy. Now, just slightly to go to the crisis of pandemic that we had and what is the cost that we've been having as a result in terms of human capital, clearly education and the lack of thereof. And also inequality as a result, because during the pandemic, poor versus rich families, well-off families, they have different access to facilities. So that's actually exacerbate the condition of inequality as well. Now, one theme that we would like to always trying to achieve, next slide, is the idea of zero extreme poverty. We would like, at the moment, this is now 3.79%. Just to give you perspective, we were facing 2 years of slowed down economic growth, a negative growth in 2020, and very slowed down economic growth in 2021. But we are still trying to achieve this noble target. We would like to achieve our zero extreme poverty by 2024. This is a hard task, and our fellow friends from universities, research institutes have been helping the government trying to design the policies, looking into the data, granular data, region by region, village by village. Really, we take advantage of a lot of network of academics, been helping the government to design our policies. Clearly, we need more of those. As I mentioned before, health, education, social protection, these are, next slide please. These are all going to be the focus of our spending. But in terms of the long term, I would like to also give you a perspective of long term what we have done so far. So next slide. This is what we are doing now, clearly is not part of just 1 year or 2 years program. This is a long term coming in terms of the reform, and we are very fortunate that the previous government, previous administration, previous generation of academics also help shape all of these policies long before I was born, maybe. Starting from 60s, we talk about health, education, family planning program, and then about education, we had 6 years compulsory education program, 9 years compulsory program since 1994. Also, if you look at social protection, this is probably a bit I would like to use slide 23 just to give you a perspective as to how, albeit imperfect, this is imperfect, to be honest with you, we wish this would be much better, but let me tell you slightly about how this approach has helped us a lot in the last 2 years in trying to reduce poverty rate, even though we are facing significant growth challenge in terms of our economic activity, even though we are facing a big challenge in terms of mobility for our population. So the program itself, we clearly look at it demographically from decile 1, decile 2, decile 3, up to at least decile 6. So if we see here, the cash transfer, the kind of conditional cash, but this one is actually conditional cash transfer, mainly focus on the 10% poorest of our society, right? And then after that, we go up to the second decile, we give a different kind of program. As we go to higher income income group, we have a different and less what do you call that? Less in terms of transfer, but more into productivity. As we go up, for example, we even gave during the 2020, 2021, we even gave wage subsidy to some of our middle class. So that's how far we were during 2020 and 2021 in terms of providing social protection to some extent. The big topic is still social protection, but also at the same time, we're looking at protection into the workers. First time ever in the history of Indonesia, back in 2020, we introduced a best practice in Indonesia compared to many other countries, clearly. First time we have an employment benefit program. In terms, and this is slightly better compared to many other countries, I think. So what we do is we have unemployment benefit, but it is tied to the obligation for the unemployed, registered unemployed person to be taking courses to increase their skills. So hopefully after several months of taking those courses online, because we were not able to meet physically during the 2020, a lot of them actually able to go back to the job market as a result when the economy is already turning back again in 2021 and so on. So this is, I would say, one of the best practice that we gain. We are happy that we were able to do some reform, strong reform, even though we are in the middle of big challenges. Now, these are all possible to be done only because we have data, albeit imperfect. Our data, our fellow Pak Sudarto will be able, Pak Elan probably going to be able to give some, shed some lights into how imperfect our data is. But given imperfection in our data, we took advantage of the availability of the data, and we make sure we took advantage to the fullest of the data. So even though we know our data is not perfect, we have inclusion and exclusion error, clearly. Please help us to fix that. We need to fix that further. But given the emergency status of 2020, 2021, we took advantage of the availability of the data, and we are able to lower the poverty rate, we lowered the unemployment rate. So in terms of well-targeting, to some extent it is well-targeting, helped by the data a lot, but we wish we could have had better data. So we wish, now we are in the process of fixing our data, and hopefully our policy making process is going to be better quality in terms of supported by the data. Just to close, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing me to share some of these insights from Indonesian perspective in the last 2.5 years. Clearly, we are in the developing economy. Our income, GNI per capita is just slightly increased to 4,200, if I'm not mistaken, last year. Slightly below the middle income, higher middle income, but we are continually growing, and we are facing this advantage of young generation. We would like to take advantage to the fullest of the potential of economic growth until 2045, before we enter the aging population period, and by the time we should be able to already achieve a high income category. Fiscal policies, clearly we are not living in a vacuum. We do take advantage, and we do have a lot of help, tremendous help from the academics, from the researchers, from the think tank. So I really appreciate the time for sharing about this with you all, and I believe that majority of you already understand the story, and we will be really happy to get a lot of feedback and a lot of collaboration with the academia. So with that, I will close. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for providing us with an overview how COVID-19 has impacted our economy. Such a very fruitful session. Ladies and gentlemen, we now welcome Dr. Riatu Mariatul Kiptia, Executive Co-Chair T20, to lead our second Keynote Policy Dialogue. Dr. Riatu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Pak Febrio, for insightful keynote speech in the context of perspective of Indonesia responding to the crisis, and also on the target short-term and long-term, including mitigation and eliminating zero extreme poverty. Without further ado, given our delay, this session, we have very lucky with us today, our speakers, leading scholars that also have extensive experience in policy making. We have here with us Professor James Foster. Hello, Professor. Hi, thank you. Professor James Foster is the professor from George Washington University. He also initiated the FGT index measurement, which is also the basis for multidimensional poverty measurement. And here with us in the panelists, also we have here Professor Bambang Brojonegoro. Hello, Prof. Bambang, my former boss with Pak Dede as well here. I'm nervous actually. Prof. Bambang Brojonegoro currently is the T20 chair of Indonesia. T20 is the think tank 20, one of the engagement group of G20 Indonesia. And here also in the panelists, Professor, oh sorry, but actually our leading scholars here, Dr. Muhammad Hatib Basri. He is a former Minister of Finance and the lead chairs of Task Force 7020 on international finance and economic recovery. Glad to be here with us, Dr. Hatib Basri and Prof. Bambang. And the last but not least, my seniors, Dr. Sudarno. He has extensive assisting the government on poverty alleviation program. He is also a senior advisor in TNP 2K and the Semeru Research Institute. Welcome to all of the panelists here. Welcome to the stage. Thank you. Okay, okay. Okay, in this keynote policy dialogue, the second one, in the morning session, we have the discussion on the utilization of the research. And in this context, we also will discuss on the policy making, the context of the poverty measurement development and the philosophy behind it. So we have here for our first speaker, Professor James Foster. You are introduced the FGT index that will that become the basis of multidimensional poverty measurement. So would you like to share with us all here on the context of the development of the utilization of the index, as well as, especially in the current context of the crisis, how it may relate it also on the policy-making process? Thank you.
Thank you. Is my microphone working? I'm very quiet, so I'm worried that people can not hear me.
No, I don't think. It's okay now.
Great. I also like to. I also like to walk around because I'm a professor. My apologies if you don't like watching people walk around, but it's kind of how I do it. Could we first off put the first slide on as I introduced? Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm going to actually walk away from the party here and then take my mask off so I can make sure you hear me. I would hate for you not to hear. So, could I have this slide, please? First of all, thanks so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, meeting old friends such as my student, Dono. Gosh, it's been so long since we've seen each other face to face, and it's like old time. And then all the new friends that I'm meeting, table of course over here, and sitting up on the panel. Thank you so much for having me here for this discussion. Now, I will act like a professor. I apologize. It's who I am. And so today I want to do a little teaching. Is it okay? Thank you, class. So let's see if it, I think that there may be some problems with it. Let's see if there is. It's a little bit vague, isn't it? Yeah. Can you still read it? Yes. Okay. So it's pretty much agreed that Indonesia has
Ini bisa.
It's pretty much agreed. And how do I know that? Because we wrote a paper recently that appeared in a journal which ranked all the different countries in terms of it and the various criteria, and Indonesia was quite on top. This is reflected in the national poverty statistics that we've been seeing in the discussion today. So it adheres to, do you want me to? Yeah? I do need a mic too? I'd hate to, okay, here, take this, okay. Right. It adheres to really the best practices at World Bank, and so therefore we see a lot of great information coming forth on consumption poverty. Rich, very frequent sources of data. In fact, we learned today unified data, which is amazing for multidimensional poverty measurement, as we shall see in a while. Frequently reporting a FGT, including not just the usual headcount, but the poverty gap and the squared gap measures. So it's quite an amazing example. I know India does a lot of good reporting of FGT as well, at least under years ago there was a lot of reporting. So similarly, in many other countries, the same way, but Indonesia particularly, uses also the full spectrum of the properties of FGT. Decomposability is what allows you to see the overall picture of poverty and then say, here's what this region contributes. Here's what this group contributes. Decomposability is very important. It's given out in reports. We see it time and again. This is a central way of being able to target groups in order to alleviate poverty. The other thing is that the approach, the FGT approach, is actually quite simple. If you look at it, it's very basic. And so we'll look at it today. That's very convenient for letting people understand what the numbers say. It becomes a conversation that people say, oh, the numbers are saying this. Maybe there's greater inequality now, or maybe there's this part of the region or this part of the country needs more effort. And it has many other helpful axioms and so on being used here. So recently, oh, I apologize. If I hold it up, it makes noise, and that's what I'm worried about. Of course. Oh, there's a mask. Okay. Okay. All right, how about that? Great. Thank you for that, Sabina. Recently, Sabina, it's not that recent now. How long was it? 2006. 2006. Yes, we created what was called the Multidimensional Poverty Index and a new approach to looking at it. It was published in 2011. And this has kind of changed the way that we think about measuring poverty. It was soon adopted by the World Bank, by the UN, actually not soon by the World Bank, but soon by the UN, later on adopted by the World Bank, and by a number of nations as they grapple with the question, how do we address SDG target 1.2? Does it say 2.1? My apologies, I didn't even notice. Today's focus is to answer the following questions. What is the Alkire-Foster approach to measuring multidimensional poverty? How does it relate to the FGT? It's a natural question. How might it augment the view offered by consumption poverty? How does multidimensional poverty augment this view? And then finally, how might it help direct policy? Now, a lot of this will be in the last section, and I hope to have some interaction with you on that. But let me carry on in the first teaching section. The bottom line here that you're going to get out of the whole thing is that The MPI is as simple as the poverty gap and, in fact, the FGT measures. But it's far more powerful as a tool for directing policy. Could you please change the slide? Yes, okay. Here's the outline. We'll have a quick review of FGT. We'll have a quick discussion on Alcar and Foster. And then we'll have the discussion of the possibilities of this technology. All right. So let's just go back a step. Amartya Sen, 1976, divided the measurement of poverty into two steps. First, identification. Who is poor? It's useful for targeting, right? Second, aggregation. How much poverty is there out there? This is, of course, helpful for evaluation and for monitoring of poverty. Consumption poverty uses what for identification? A poverty line. This poverty line has the property that you're poor if you're below that cutoff. Now, I've put up my first example, and it looks like you're a good person to question. If the poverty line is 5, and the distribution is 7, 3, 4, 8, different persons' income, who's poor?
Would it be 3 and 4?
What? It would be the ones with income 3 and 4, indeed. I thought you might have said persons 3 and 4. But it's the people with the incomes 3 and 4, person 2 and person 3. That's right. What about aggregation? For aggregation, a poverty measure is used. The most natural group of poverty measures I'll introduce right now is the FGT class. And you see right here, we have poverty of the distribution X, given the poverty line pi, is equal to the average of something. What is that something? Well, down here, this GI is the normalized shortfall. How about that one?
Heather.
Let's try this. The poverty line minus the consumption or income level over the poverty line tells you the percentage by which a poor person's income is falling below the poverty line. It could be halfway down, in which case you get 50%. It could be 10% down. So this GI tells you that, and then it's raised to some power alpha. Normalized shortfall to a power. Averaged up across all the poor people and the rich people, where the rich people have 0 shortfall. That average is the FGT measure. For each alpha, there's a different fundamental measure. The first one, with alpha equals 0, turns everything that's positive into a 1. Any number that's raised to 0 becomes 1. Anything, right, with 0 stays at 0. So you have an average of a bunch of 0 ones, where you have 1 for every poor person, and a bunch of 0s for the non-poor people. Add them up, divide by the number of people, that's the head count ratio. Now, that's not good enough as a measure. You'd like to know how far below the poverty line people are on average. The gap is found by having alpha equals 1. And the FGT2 incorporates inequality, happens when alpha equals 2. It's a lot easier to do it with an example, so I'll just quickly run through the same example you were looking at a second ago. Those two people are poor. Average of that vector, the deprivation vector, is 1/2. Half the people are poor because you have 2 over 4. That's poverty. To get the poverty gap, you take the shortfall below. The first person's 4/5 of the way down below poverty line. Quite poor. The next person is only 1/5 of the way down. On average, you can see that the overall average is 5/20. The poverty gap. It also is expressible as the head count times the average depth of poverty among the poor. This H times I is really useful because you have a frequency of poverty, how common is it out there that people are poor, and then how on average the intensity is. That's what I is. Finally, if you notice, this doesn't really differentiate between if there's a lot of inequality among the poor or whether they were identical or whether. So by squaring these numbers, by making the power 2, emphasize this person's gap and de-emphasize the smaller gap. What that does is it says if you have a lot of people with big gaps, squaring it keeps that big. For the rest of the people, it becomes very small and negligible. So the final measure, the FGT measure, P2 measure, does just that. Squares that normalized shortfall. Notice the difference between 1 to 4 versus 1 to 13, 1 to 16. Much bigger difference here. Average this up, and that is the squared gap. All right. Does everyone get that? It is pretty straightforward. Looking at numbers from data would give you more insight as to what it's measuring as you look at different groups. All right. So what properties are satisfied by this measure? Let me have a quick digression. What are properties? What are axioms? Did anyone hear the word axioms when you were in school? I did. Anyone else? 11? Okay, that's a good axiom. An axiom is usually taken as a very precise statement. It's a property which is rigorous and used in all kinds of mathematical formulation. I don't see axioms that way. Axioms are little nuggets of policy. They're telling you what should happen if a change occurs in a distribution. They're telling you that you should ignore certain changes in the distribution. You should focus on other changes, and that's how you can decrease poverty. And they also say, well, what happens if you have a subgroup here and a subgroup here and you combine them? So the 3 forms of axioms are invariance axioms, where you ignore certain types of changes that don't affect poverty. Dominance axioms, where this type of change decreases poverty. And then finally, composition axioms that allow you to do that targeting that we've talked about. It's so important to have decompositions to be able to focus on populations. All right. The list of axioms for FGT, I'll just mention them here, I don't care. Decomposability is a crucial one. It's in blue right there. And monotonicity for the poverty gap, that when an income falls for a poor person, poverty should rise. Seems natural. Head count ratio doesn't satisfy it. That's why we look at the other measures. How do you measure poverty when there's many dimensions? Well, this is a hard thing to do because you have incommensurate things you're trying to combine together to create one indicator. Our approach was based on what we just saw, the FGT, at least in terms of aggregation. We use a standard FGT approach and generalize it to many dimensions. The hard part here was deciding who is poor. You don't have just one cutoff. You have many dimensions. So, to do so, you start with individual cutoffs, deprivation cutoffs as they're called. 1 per dimension, say if you have a health variable, an education variable, and so on. Cutoff, cutoff, cutoff. Below, you're deprived. Below, you're deprived. Above, not deprived. And then you check out all the deprivations and you say, this one's very important, that's less, this one's more. use weights, and see whether it's the case that your score is coming above a cutoff, poverty cutoff K. And if it's above it, then you're poor. In fact, if you have an equal to K, you're also considered poor. So that's the idea. It's that simple, deciding who is poor in this world. You are poor if you're multiply deprived enough. The breadth of poverty is large enough. So let's just have a quick example to anchor these thoughts before I move on. Here's a matrix of data. Remember in the old data with income, it's a vector. Here, it's a matrix. In this example, you might imagine the first dimension is income, dollars per day. Second is years of schooling. Third is self-reported health. Finally, social services. Cutoffs are given 13, 12, 3, 1, just for example. And let's assume equal weights, just for example. This is coming from the US environment, from our paper originally. This doesn't tell us who's poor. It tells you who's deprived, the ones who have underlines in a dimension. That's the deprived ones. You see, 12.5 is below 13, so you're deprived in income. Person 3 is. Does this make sense? You can translate this measure, this matrix, into a 0-1 matrix, describing who is deprived and in what dimension, and there it is. On the left-hand side, the G0, you see that third person here is deprived in the first dimension, just like we saw. But it doesn't tell us who is poor. To find out who's poor, you have to have a cutoff in terms of how many dimensions or what share of dimensions you're considered to be deprived in. So let's say K is equal to 2. So in half the dimensions, you are deprived. The two middle people, you can tell, and I could have asked that question to you again, the two middle people have 2 or above in terms of their scores. The poverty scores, the deprivation scores. So these two are poor. This one is not. Only deprived in 1 out of the 4. As a result, we don't need to worry about this person as being poor. Let's censor that information. This is the censored deprivation matrix with 0, where we zero out that extra deprivation. Yes, this person's deprived in education or schooling, but not poor. Different ministries are involved. Okay, so we ignore those deprivations, and then, before I go on, let me remind you that you could actually construct 2 different matrices that are just like those other matrices where you're measuring depth, but we need to have data that are cardinal, where it makes sense to look at how low or high things are. Quality of the floor can't be measured too easily as a cardinal measure, and yet that's a crucial indicator for many, many places. So if your variables are ordinal, you can't go this route. You can't incorporate the inequality this way and depth this way. Aggregation can be done, however, in general to obtain this class, the M alpha class of measures. And what you do is you take this matrix, just like we did with the vector, and look at its average. The average of the matrix, add them up, divide by the number of entries. This is the adjusted FGT. And it's a generalization directly from the FGT. And if you had 1 dimension, it would become going back to the FGT, if it was only 1 dimension. All right, since we don't typically have cardinal data, and things are impractical in that case, we focus on alpha equals 0, which is the adjusted headcount ratio, M0. What does that look like? It's practical and applicable. Here is the deprivation, censored deprivation matrix. Add up all the entries and divide by the number of entries. I believe that you'll get, what will you get? 6 out of 16? Does that look right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? 16. So 6 out of 16 are 3/8. It turns out that's the same as the head count ratio times the average deprivation share among the poor. 2 out of 4 this person is deprived. 4 out of 4 this second poor person is deprived. Their average is 3 out of 4. Multiply those two together and you get the overall measure. See the relationship between the poverty gap? H times I now turns to H times A measure of breadth. So this tells you the axioms. As you can tell, very similar axioms to FGT, where dimensional monotonicity means that if you add a dimension in which a person is deprived, and that person was originally poor, poverty goes up. Decomposability, likewise, is being satisfied for all of these measures. So this is kind of a summary of the main part of this discussion. It is that you have an analogous discussion between the poverty gap from FGT and the MPI, or adjusted headcount ratio. It's equal to an H times A versus H times I, headcount ratio times frequency. And therefore, there's this natural interpretation that you can give for one versus the other. This is really useful for communicating. All right. Who's using the MPIs? We've seen it in the discussion today. Lots of governments, including India. We have representatives here today. United Nations uses the global MPI through the UNDP in conjunction with OPHI. In the Sustainable Development Goals, this is the natural measure to use for 1.2, which I write here in terms of all dimensions. We heard that said a second ago. And the World Bank, after the Atkinson report, has been including their multidimensional poverty measure. Now notice that that measure has income in it, and there's a question whether you want to have the income in the measure that's multidimensional or not. Have it as a separate measure. That's a really interesting question, and it's one we can discuss. All right, so this is where I'm going to end off in terms of the various rationales. Why is MPI being used? This is really where the core of the matter is. The MPIs are being used because, they're really simple headline metrics for monitoring and understanding what's going on and communicating to people about what's going on in terms of multidimensional poverty. Very effective. They're simple, but sophisticated. They break down in a number of ways that allows incredible policy analysis, as we'll see below. And they're linked to the well-embedded FGT indices. So it's not a far cry, if you're using the FGT, to move to the multidimensional approach. They have a coordinated dashboard for policy analysis. You use decomposability to view regionally what's going on in poverty, and then build back up to the total figure. But also dimensional breakdown by dimension allows you to see which dimensions are the one driving poverty. That's exciting as well, because you can then focus more effectively in a region as to what's driving the poverty within that region. So very powerful. If you look at most of the presentations out of OPHI, there's a picture of Africa, which is with very small district level type of data, describing what's happening in multidimensional poverty across large groups of countries and regions in Africa. It shows the granularity that this measure can go with. It supports good governance. Consistent with the political cycle, you can see what's going on before you're out of office. Your people can see it. Citizens can judge you as to your progress over the 3 years before we have to start preparing for the election. This is useful. Income, it's really hard to do that. Consumption, it's hard to do that. It's hard to really drive income without transfers. It reduces political risk from income shocks. Mexico, right after they implemented the measure, they had a big shock, 2008. Income fell, but they could point to all the other dimensions and how deprivations had been brought down in those dimensions. So even though this shock from the US had hit Mexico hard, it did not lead to political disaster for the government. And it aligns very nicely, government and citizen, seeing the measure and following each other, holding each other accountable, and by the way, the private sector and other stakeholders. It's a great way to allow this kind of joint working together in ways that we really don't do often enough. It can be done with this type of measure. It can also help coordinate national development policies by de-siloing ministries. Here, this ministry is doing what it's doing. Here's this one. No, to do poverty, you have to combine all the people together at the same table. Because we will not succeed if we're not all helping with education, with health, like we saw the great results today. Combining those is what affects poverty. I call this measurement as leadership because if the measure's out there and we all see it, we all work toward it, it's a form of leading us to work toward the things that need to be done. Very effective. It's also, as we saw, guiding budgets, and the example of Costa Rica was given by Gonzalo today and a number of other people. And it's upgradable technology. It has been upgraded, as you saw, with M1 or M2 if you have cardinal variables. That includes inequality, M2. But if you don't have cardinal variables, it still can be upgraded through a new paper in which we talk about M-gamma measures, incorporating some part of inequality, but inequality in the breadth, if you will. Finally, it's fully localizable, which means that you can go from global MPI at the world level, national or regional MPIs, say South or Latin America, to national MPIs, to local MPIs that communities themselves put together to help themselves achieve what they need to get out of poverty. This is really useful. So what do you think? Could these rationales apply here? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor James, for selling how is actually the MPI could be linked to the policy context. And given to this address by Professor James, Professor Bambang, as Indonesia currently also G20 hosts the G20, and you are also the chair of the T20, how it might be the measurement or standardized context of understanding the poverty in multidimensional issue might be potential as the global cooperation or more on national. Yeah.
I hope, okay, it's good. Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank, Professor Foster for enlightening us about the poverty measurement. And certainly in the T20, as one of engagement group of G20, we will really consider the use of the concept of MPI related to, I think, two important issues, especially on the recovery after the pandemic. Number one would be, we know that because of the pandemic, many people that previously not on the poverty, they are above poverty line, now they could become part of the poor people because somehow, because of the pandemic, their income decline or they are losing jobs or their, small enterprises have to be stopped, then they could be part of the poverty. And the second issue would be about inequality. In several forums that I attended, the issue actually is not just about the poverty, but rising inequality due to the poverty, due to the pandemic. And it happens not only in emerging economy or developing economy, but also happens in developed economy. So, in my opinion, and especially because this event is part of our T20, especially on the Task Force 5, talking about poverty and inequality in general, then the understanding of MPI would really help policymakers, let's say in all, let's say G20 members, as well as other parts of the world, that the increasing poverty happens because of declining income. Declining income, of course, happens because the economy somehow has to be interrupted due to the pandemic. But actually, you don't really have to worry about the increase of poverty because it might be temporary. You know, after the pandemic, after the recovery, hopefully it will be back to the normal condition. And in several countries in developed economy, like Fabio mentioned, they already have unemployment benefit. So the issue with income declining could be compensated with this unemployment benefit. But what happened with countries without unemployment benefit? They might be worried so much that the declining of income will lead to the significant increase of poverty. But then if we understand the concept of MPI, and then we understand the 10 indicators that included in the MPI, then we can identify whether the country, the government, already provides these 10 indicators that comprise basically basic services like education and health, as well as basic infrastructures, including water, sanitation, electricity, cooking fuel or cooking gas, as well as, I think there are the other two, the housing, as well as the assets. So if the country or the government already provided those basic services and basic infrastructure at the level that will not make people deprived, as Professor Foster mentioned, then basically the country or the economy still in the good condition, despite the fact that poverty coming from declining income is increasing. Because at least you can make sure that all citizens, all people can access those basic services and basic infrastructure. So I think that would be a very interesting conclusion from what MPI can offer to the policymakers, and how policymakers, and I agree with my previous conversation with Professor Foster, that government can communicate well to the people. Look, we understand this is not good condition because everybody's income is decreasing, but at least we can protect you with proper basic services, education, health, and basic infrastructures, electricity, water, sanitation, and etc. So at least it will make people come, although you don't have unemployment benefit. Of course, for countries like US that has unemployment benefit, I mean, people will not complain because at least they can still get the income during the pandemic. But don't forget, the unemployment benefit also has kind of negative impact. Unfortunately, after the pandemic, because what we understand from what happened in US, and that's why we are now experiencing so-called the high inflation globally, is simply because, you know, the people who already used to the unemployment benefit now is a bit reluctant to go back to work. Say they prefer, I think I prefer to stay home, getting still my employment benefit, rather than getting a little bit higher income, but I have to work. So that's why there is probability disruption on the supply side that cannot match the spiking demand coming out because of the end of the pandemic, or basically the relieving of the pandemic. So that's maybe one lesson learned from MPI to our T20 at the global level. The second about inequality, and it's quite surprising. Inequality rising because of the pandemic. It means that the poor people or the people who are at disadvantage cannot get through the pandemic. I mean, they don't have any solution during the pandemic. But at the other end, there might be small group of people, the middle up, that can get through the pandemic. Somehow they still get the advantage of pandemic. For example, the people who have the digital companies that, for example, as simple as say, because now we are using Zoom, whoever invented Zoom must get maybe skyrocketing profit because of the pandemic. And it creates bigger discrepancy, bigger disparity with people who lost the jobs or they have to lose their business because of the pandemic. Simple as that. And interestingly, the discussion about inequality also happens on the developed economy. So I can understand now why inequality happens in developed economy, because the digital business somehow, of course, benefit few groups of people. But then, why MPI is relevant to the discussion about inequality? Again, inequality, I mean, the event of inequality could be detrimental to many countries, especially if the government or the economy cannot provide the basic services and basic infrastructure at the proper level for everybody. If those services and basic infrastructure provided at the proper level, although they might see some kind of inequality, they might have opinion that, okay, there are some people who benefit from the current economic condition, but as long as we still get the access to basic services and basic infrastructure at the proper level, we are still okay. We will not be mad at the government. We will not be angry at the so-called the rich people who get the advantage because of the pandemic. So this might be one aspect of MPI that could be explored more, of course, by my colleagues in Task Force 5, but at least we get some enlightenment because of the existence of this index. And then if I can also share my previous experience when I was still Minister of Development Planning, then the lecture about MPI, just brought by Professor Foster, I think will be very much enlightening for me, at least for me as a former policymakers. I remember my days whenever the Central Bureau Agency release, I think they release every 6 months, the headcount index, the P1, P2, and usually, of course, I mean, the chair of Central Bureau will deliver the message, but at that time, I have to be ready as a part of the government to defend all the numbers, especially to whom? Yeah, to opposition. I mean, both in parliament as well as, in the media. And that was the time when I really tried to learn very much about all of these indicators. But unfortunately, at that time, we haven't touched much about the MPI. It's more on the FGT and it's more about poverty gap. But at least whenever the opposition or whoever trying to look at different way, at least I can argue with them from theoretical perspective, and it really helps. But of course, my job is not just to defend the statistic to the opposition or to the other parties who might not who might disagree with the government. But more importantly, my job at that time was mostly how to reduce the poverty itself, how to make sure people that Indonesia do not feel poor. And of course, the MPI, after I learned from Professor Foster's lecture, is very much helpful. At least, if we are not ready to, let's say, publicize the MPI to the public, it's okay. You can still publicize the headcount index, P1, P2, and then usually I also discuss about the distribution of both poverty and inequality in Indonesia based on provinces. But then the next target is how to reduce the poverty itself and how to ensure people get better access to basic infrastructure and basic services. And those 10 indicators under the MPI, I think is really helpful. At least it will help any Minister of Finance or Minister of Development everywhere, especially in the developing economy, to prioritize the budget. I think I can share with you because Pak Hatim Basri was also former finance minister. The hardest thing for every finance minister, especially, let's say in a country like Indonesia, is to determine the priority of the budget. Because every ministry, every agency will say, my field is the very important or the most important. So you have to give me the bigger budget. And of course, everybody expects bigger budget every year. The only problem, we don't have that kind of money because our revenue depends on tax revenue. And unfortunately, our tax ratio is not at the ideal rate. It's still far below, let's say, the standard of even ASEAN or especially OECD countries. But that's not the issue. The issue of priority is very important. And then, of course, everybody agrees that we have to reduce the poverty and inequality. But that at the same time, they are still stubborn to say that my sector or my field is the most important. So how to combine that? With the help of MPI. Because with the list of the 10 indicators, it really helps. At least if I have that kind of equipment at that time I was Minister of Planning, I can tell, everybody who comes to my office, even the minister sometimes comes to my office directly. Look, this is the way to handle the poverty, and unfortunately, your beloved sector is not really part of this. So I can argue with them. Unfortunately, you can keep your budget as it is like last year. Any possible increase of budget has to come from where? From the list. So at least it helps. And then if we are trying to look one by one, of course, very quickly, let's say in health, child mortality, very important, but in Indonesia, there is another important variable. The mother mortality itself is also a big issue in Indonesia. The rate of mother mortality, especially after giving birth, is still higher than the world standard. So it means we have also to, accompany our analysis with the existing data, including the mother mortality. Nutrition is very much important. That's why, since 2018, when I was still at Bappenas, we launched the so-called multi-sector action on stunting. Why at that time stunting is important? Because previously, people do not care about stunting. People do not realize that our stunting at that time was more than 30%, 33%. 1/3 of children under 5 years old stunting. And that's not good for the future of our country because, unfortunately, stunting is somehow unrecoverable. Once you get stunting and you are not treated properly, then for the whole life, you have to live with the stunting. And part of the stunting problem coming from the nutrition. Of course, there are other factors, including also in MPI, which is water and sanitation. And unfortunately, these two basic infrastructures are not really sexy to be discussed in any newspaper in media. Why don't you check online media, newspapers, television, any media, any information available in Indonesia. When they are talking about infrastructure, as if the only infrastructure is road. And I have a lot of guests coming to my office, not only from parliament, but also from regions. And whenever they, trying to, trying to ask for the additional budget for infrastructure, the one at the top is always road, arterial road connecting from point A to point B. Almost uniform. Everybody asks for the road. Nobody really asks for water and sanitation. And the problem with the water, I believe most of you live in Jakarta. Do you know that Jakarta is only covered by 50% of water pipe distribution? So what happened with other 50%? Even in my house, I cannot get the pipe water because it doesn't reach my area of living. So I have to hire someone to get into the groundwater. And that's how many Jakarta get their water. But of course, to get groundwater, you have to pay quite expensive. What happened with the lower middle or low income class in Jakarta? How can they get water if their area is not connected to the water distribution? Well, they have to buy the water. And they are at the lowest income, and they have to buy the water, which is more expensive even than aqua, even than bottled water. So you can imagine that the level of poverty they have to suffer because they live in Jakarta. I'm not talking about some remote areas far away in Indonesia. It's in Jakarta. So that's why I think the attention to the water sanitation is very much important. I would say now, it's maybe more important than at least the connecting roads, at least for now, because our stunting is very high. And one problem with stunting coming from unavailability or lack of availability of clean water and sanitation, okay? And then, if you are talking about electricity, maybe it's still okay, but don't forget what Fabrio just mentioned, very costly. Electricity, yes, it is accessible, affordable, quote unquote, but very high subsidy, very costly. I think both of us as finance minister always have problem whenever we have the rise of oil price, the rise of course, at one side, we are happy because tax revenue will be increasing. But on the other side, on the spending issue, the subsidy will be rising if we still continue with the current subsidy policy. So something has to be done, of course, with this subsidy policy. But I don't want to talk about that because we are now focusing on the MPI. And then similar with the cooking fuel or cooking gas, because yes, it is affordable, it is available, but at a relatively high cost of subsidy. And one more basic infrastructure that I think a little bit behind in Indonesia, housing. Because, one of the MPI is about the housing or about the floors. I never seen any massive public housing programs in Indonesia, especially in the urban areas. While in urban areas, of course, the land of price so high, so I don't think people can afford to have the house, landed house. So it means government has to step in, like what they are doing in Singapore or even in Russia. They build public housing massively. And if you cannot buy the unit, at least you can rent. So you don't have to be homeless or you don't have to stay in a far from ideal housing condition. And that's the basic infrastructure that should be provided by the government. And in Indonesian case, when you are talking about basic services and basic infrastructures, I really agree what one of the slides from Professor Foster saying localize. MPI is very easy to be localized. And that's actually the most important thing for our bupatis, governors, and mayors. Otherwise, they don't have any clue how to make their people prosperity. I mean, how to create prosperity for the people. Because, you know, what they're complaining first, whenever they become mayors, governors, and bupatis, our budget is low. I mean, of course, why cannot you take, why don't you take, I mean, why you are so eager to be bupati, governor, and mayors if, you know, the budget is limited? It's there, it's a situation. But with the limited budget, actually, using the MPI, localized MPI, then you can identify, you can priority. Rather than just saying, okay, building the road, or building here, building there, but you have to have a real program to ensure poverty, local poverty can be reduced. If local poverty can be reduced, then hopefully nationwide, it will be very much helpful. You know, rather than government paying too much attention, spending so much budget just to reduce poverty at the national level. It has to be not only top down, but also the bottom up process. And I really think the MPI could be a good guide, you know, for any policymakers in Indonesia, both at the central as well as local level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Bambang, for addressing also that the MPI can be used for policy and conducted not in silo, and coordination between national and local. And also continue to Dr. Basri. We are fortunate here to have two former finance ministers. So Prof. Bambang will not touch about the budget priorities, but I know that you pointed out frequently on the need to make priority, especially in the time of the crisis, and how is we understand the poverty evolvement in this context using the MPI as well. Professor Basri.
Thank you very much, Beato. I hope you don't mind that I'm sitting here. First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Foster for your excellent presentation. I really enjoy your presentation. It reminds me with my good old days sitting as a student in the class, you know, and learning about this famous FGT. Before I start about this policy implication, let me highlight why this topic, the multi-dimensional poverty index, is very important for all of us, especially after the pandemic. Yeah, Pak Bambang touched some of the issues already. But I think the way I look at this situation, the post-pandemic era, the pandemic changed various aspects of our life. Yeah, and I think we probably need a sort of like a different perspective or also an indicators about the way we look at development. Yeah. First, let me talk about, Pak Bambang also touched this issue, is the risk of the K-shaped recovery. Because one thing that we learned from the pandemic, there were some groups in the population, they could afford to stay at home because they have this enough non-labor income. Yeah. But what about the poor people? They don't have non-labor income. So if you ask them to stay at home, you need to compensate them. Yeah. You have to pay them. Yeah. People are being paid to stay at home. But for the middle and upper class, probably lockdown policy is something that favorable. It's good for their health, you know, is also safety for them, but probably not for the lower middle income group. So this pandemic have this very disproportionate impact on the various income level. That's the first one. The second one, the K-shaped recovery, was also perhaps different, driven by what Pak Bambang mentioned. we've been seeing that a group of the community that could survive during the pandemic was the one who have an access for the digital. Yeah, because it reminds me with the situation in 1998, they're very similar. The way the people survived at that time is by sort of like selling food, etc. But at that time, because there was no pandemic and people can sell it on the street. But during the pandemic, they did it through the Instagram, the Facebook, etc. Yeah. So if you have an access for the digital, you could survive. And that's also explained why big companies who have the digital access or the ability to transform themselves into digital could survive. But it's very unfortunate because the issue of the digital divide, not all of the people have an access for that. And if you look at the study conducted by Asian Development Bank in Asia, there was about perhaps around 27% that students that did not have access for the online. So you can see the possibility of this risk of the setback, the quality of the human capital because of that. Yeah. The third aspect related to the K-shaped recovery is this pandemic also hit disproportionately sectors. Yeah. If you are a sort of like working in a fixed salary, then probably you could continue to do your work from home, and you get paid. But what about people at the informal sector? Yeah, because they have to, go to the market and then sell their product, etc. And then if you look at, especially in the case of Indonesia, and it's very similar in many places all over the world, most of the people who work at the informal sector are women. So I can see the impact of this gender issue as well. Yeah, that women, affected more perhaps than the men, the issue of this pandemic. So the way we look at this aspect of this development after the pandemic is probably we have to look at more from the various or the multi aspect rather than a single perspective. Yeah, so that is why this MPI is a very crucial and very important. In addition to that, I would like also to add, Pak Bambang mentioned about it. If we use I'm not an expert on this poverty, unlike Pak Darno and yourself, Professor Foster, but if we use a sort of like, the definition of this poverty, yeah, and then Pak Bambang mentioned that during the pandemic, even the vulnerable groups can, go into this poverty because they lost their income. Yeah, even though before they were not considered as poor because lockdown effect, etc. So that is why I remember Pak Darmo perhaps on the March 2020 with our friends Ben Olken and Ray Mahana, we proposed to the government to extend the social protection not only for the poor people, but also to the vulnerable groups, and focusing using the World Bank definition, the aspiring middle class, not only the poor people. So my first message is, it is very important to look at this issue about this social aspect, the poverty aspect, in the more broader perspective. And my concern is if we sort of like stick with this, the old measurement, perhaps we cannot sort of like reach out some of these factors. Yeah. The second issue that I would like to touch, this is more on the concept. Yeah. The pandemic also changed the way we look at the concept of development. In many countries, we probably more focus on, I've been working a lot on the macro and trade issue, mostly focus on the issue of this macro stability, economic growth, etc., emphasize on the economic perspective. But one thing that we learned from the pandemic, it's very often, this is must be familiar to you, Pak Bambang, the way the Minister of Finance look at the spending on health, yeah, is expenditure. Yeah, because if you look at the spending on health, the growth is much faster than GDP per capita. So there is no way that health spending could be funded unless we change the program. But one thing that we learned from the pandemic is health is not just a matter of expenditure, but it is an investment. Yeah, when the health system collapse and the economy collapse, so we should do something on this issue of health. This is a very important investment. Yeah, so that is why the way we look at the perspective of development is also very important. Yeah, and then with the MPI, the 10 indicators you refer about this education, the health, the sanitation, electricity, etc. Yeah, the other thing that's also very important we have to look at on this issue, especially related after the pandemic, is access. Yeah, and one thing that if we try to look at about the impact of this pandemic through the capabilities approach that introduced by Amartya Sen, so I can imagine the impact will be very devastating related to that issue because disproportionately impact that I mentioned earlier, right? So in terms of this is rather theoretical. We probably have to think about this measurement that could also taken into account how to measure or the ability to include the freedom to access. And I think this is very important, yeah, because after the pandemic, I think we have to look at the concept of prosperity, not because people have those things that they have, but because the activities that allow us to have those kind of goods and services they have. So that is why the freedom of achievement is very important in order to make sure that people will function, right? In this particular context, I don't think the sort of like the traditional measurement related to the issue of poverty will be the appropriate one. We need to get something that more broader. So that is why the MPI become very important and very crucial. And then the way we look at the issue of development is not just focusing on economic growth. We put more weight on this, you're focusing on the economy, then prosperity will follow. But we have to look at also what Amartya Sen called, development as freedom. Yeah, and I think we learned something on this process of the pandemic. So that is why I really like to see that this multi-dimensional poverty index, if this could be extended, enriched with this sort of like the new development, that will be very something useful. The second aspect that I would like to touch is about the policy implication of this. Yeah, because again, when we talk about the policy, measurement is very important. Indicators is very important. Once we have this, the measurement about the targeting, about what will be the priority, then we can talk about budget. Pak Bambang touched the issue about this fuel subsidy. While I'll agree that, by putting the subsidy, you could induce the purchasing power, but the question is, it is this disproportionate impact because the middle and upper class, they consume gasoline 6 times higher than the poor people. So even though you sort of like provide, you ensuring that the purchasing power is there, but disproportionately this kind of policy, will beneficial for the middle upper income group rather than the lower income group. So that is why if we look at from this multi-dimensional poverty index, it's better for us to focus on the targeting subsidy. And this is very important when we speak about this budget allocation. Yeah. And I would like to touch the climate change issue as well. And nowadays, it's a bit unrelated, but I want to see that under this kind of situation, I can imagine that the policymakers now are faced by the sort of like huge constraint, maybe from the budget constraint, and also the multiple objective. So the way we look at the development issue is, we cannot look at from the single perspective, but we have to think about the policy can be co-benefits for other aspects as well. Yeah. In related to that, I want to touch about the issue of this, to protect the vulnerable groups, also good for environment and also good for macro. And I cannot think a better policy than reduction of the fuel subsidy, because it will reduce the demand for fossil fuel. This is good for green. And this is supposed to be politically sound, because you use the money, redirect the transfer from the middle upper income group to the poor people. You can sell it to the people by saying, look, I use this budget, this is not the fuel price adjustment, but this is to redirect subsidy from the upper middle income group to the poor one. So this kind of model, this kind of policy, if we use a sort of like, more broader perspective, that could help us. Yeah. So with that note, I think I really want to support about this, the importance of this multidimensional poverty index. And I do hope that this, sorry, I always forget about this Task Force 5 or 5 or 5, Pak Asep and the team, that probably we could learn something, yeah, because I do believe that after the pandemic, we probably have to look at the issue of development, including the social protection, the impact on the poverty from different perspectives. So I leave it up here. Once again, Professor Foster, I really enjoy your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Dede. I know that you have to catch a plane.
No, I still have 10 minutes.
Okay, okay. So I think without further ado, Pak Darno, you have extensive assisting the government on poverty programs, and you also, I think, long time colleagues with Professor Foster. What do you see of what have been done by Indonesia in the major system of the social assistance program, and the context of what have been addressed by Pak Dede, the co-benefits given the government priority might also quite expanded.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Can you hear me, everyone? Good afternoon, thank you for coming, and I'm honored and humble and grateful to be with this distinguished panel, and especially my former teacher, Professor Tim Foster. He was my teacher during my grade school at Vanderbilt University. I know he is supposed to be with his family in Chennai, and he made it here, and thank you so much for coming and attending here. And also with my colleague, dear friends, and also partner in crime, Professor Dede Basri and Professor Bambang Brojonegoro. So I don't have much comment in terms of Professor Foster's presentation on the MPI. I have a couple of slides. Can you put it in, Brent, please? I think we all agree that poverty is indeed inherently multidimensional. And in terms of the axiom, the relevant, the underlying assumption of what Professor Foster presented are already well established. I've been following his work for quite some time. FGT is definitely his creation. I think that is the most quoted index in the world. Every country adopted it. Indonesia uses it twice every year, in the month of July and also February. December or something like that. Pak Bambang was the Minister of Bappenas, always released that number. I'm also aware that Dr. Sabina Akhiri and her team at Oxford has been working very hard to improve the dimensions in terms of refining the indicators, because it's, measuring poverty is a very tricky, despite of the optimism that Professor Foster already mentioned, very simple. But because of this multidimensionality, it's also make us very complex, especially for the policymakers like the former minister. Number one, if you should be able to use the measure to do the intervention and also test your hypothesis, whether your intervention is working or not. And secondly, the most important thing is actually, does it comparable across space and across time. The comparability of Pak Dede, maybe the next Minister of Finance, we don't know, and Pak Bambang, invested in the 5-6 trillion on social protection or in social another Kartu Prakerja, for example. What is going to be the impact of that program over time? So you have to have this yardstick of that is comparable across time and across space. Maybe Prof. Walter and also Sabina can respond to that. And even with this consumption-based measure of poverty, which also following Professor Foster's innovation of measuring it, it's still weakly absolute. We do not exactly using an absolute yardstick in terms of comparing over time. So there is some dimension of the relativity of our measure, Pak Bambang. That's why we discuss about the possibility of improving the way how PPS is counting the poor using the Susuna's consumption measure. I think Pak Asep, Pak Teguh are also member of the Societal Committee Forum. If you can improve that, will be next. So I just have a nice picture here, bro. Not just being nice to you, that poverty is inherently multidimensional. Indeed, it's inherently multidimensional. But because of that, it's also very complicated in measuring it if you have to have it over time. So my only suggestion for MPI in the future, Dr. Sabina, if possible, I think we need to also broaden the dimension of the quality. I already mentioned with Professor Foster during lunchtime. Let's say if we talk about education, just, measuring enrollment doesn't seem to be right at the present time because there is a quality dimension. It's a bit thin, but we have to make it thicker so that we can capture the holistic well-being. Our children go to school, but actually they didn't learn that much. So our learning profile, not only Indonesia, if India, it's relatively flat for the last 10 years, despite all of the investment we put it in. And also on the dimension of health, even if we already give them some of the health card, maybe they are not willing to go to the health facilities, so there are many dimensions. I also would like to echo Mas Khatib Basri about adding this capability that Professor Sen already mentioned. I know this is like ideals in terms of the capabilities, in terms of your participation in the societal group and also in many other dimensions. I think that's, and then some of the question is on the width that we have to put it in. After all, poverty is a social construct. It depends on how you would like to define. You can define poverty $5, $3, $2. To me, what matters is actually the change over time. Not the level. We can have 20% poverty, doesn't matter. Pak Bambang become the minister, and then my target by 5 years, I want to reduce that by 5 percentage points. That's great. I think that's what really matters for poverty measurement. And if we can do that also from the empire, that's great. Next, I think the government realized it's not exactly corollary to what Professor Foster mentioned, but actually we understood about the multidimensionality nature of poverty. So in building this unified database, we use many variables that actually overlap with some of the MPI dimension. We have the demography, we have education, we have employment, we have housing, asset, and also even the specificity of the local. Again, maybe there's some criticism, yes, still, but your anchor is still consumption, there are no true, but the association, I was told by my colleague from Center Bureau of Statistics, the association, the correlation between MPI measures and also FGT measure, consumption base is about 60% proportion in Indonesia. Not bad, if you like to proxy that your multidimensionality by using this consumption is not bad, actually. But this is not about measurement, this is the creating index so we can have a ranking of this bottom 40% of Indonesian community. Next. But we also learn, when we constructed that unified database, we are not only using this so-called simple proxy mean testing, we also using a wealth ranking, the principal component analysis, that Professor Sabina also very aware about that one. We put that into our equation. We also introduced the machine learning. It didn't change that much. Algorithm has been, involving many algorithms to improve the way how we target our poor household. And proxy mean testing or principal component analysis or any algorithms are good when you are targeting, let's say, bottom 40%. But if you are going to reach the most vulnerable, those in the, let's say, in the bottom 5% or 10%, actually community can do better job, because they are the one who live there, who can also not only looking at their physicality, but also on the many activities that they are around. Next. So, because Mbak Riatu asked me about what has been the government in terms of the evolution of the Indonesia's targeted social program, it's all started in '98. Before the Asian financial crisis, there is no such thing as a program, because it's a broad-based economic development, bridging primary school and road and dam and everything. And then the crisis hit the country, in '98, poverty doubled, again using headcount, FGD, by 12 percentage point, and then we introduced this rise from the poor, help from the poor, scholarship from the poor. And then still then the program continues until now with some improvement. We also introduced cash transfer with conditional and unconditional. We also provided a block grant to the communities. And these are set of the program that government of Indonesia, Pak Bambang, definitely aware, because this is also part of his policy when he was the Ministry of Bapenas and also Minister of Finance. We keep doubling our budget in terms of social protection program. And we also, recently in 2020, I think we already presented about the allocation of budget, a lot of money being put in there. And we also have this pre-employment card. I saw Ibu Deni here, but she already left. Actually, the component of this pre-employment card also have some component of the social protection program. Next. I think this is going to be my last slide. My last slide is going to be the lesson that we have learned from the Indonesian targeted. Next slide, please. Indonesia. No. I think this is not the second one. This is the bottom from two. So I have my colleague here from Thailand, who is the coordinator of the task force for, not the G20 Task Force. This is the national team for the acceleration of poverty reduction program. Sebelum ini, Mas, just to show how the commitment of the government, actually, Vice President Budiono, I think that's the one I remember. I returned from Stanford for doing my sabbatical in 2010. I visited Pak Asep, I'm unemployed. Do you still want to employ me? Of course, but then Pak Budiono actually called me up. Would you like to help us working with us? Mas Darno, he called me Mas. So that's why I joined the national team on the acceleration of poverty reduction program. This is going to be my 15 years serving 3 different vice presidents, from Pak Budiono and then Pak Cika. Now we have Kiai Mahruf Amin. I'm helping Dr. Ilan Satriawan, who is the coordinator from this working group. The idea behind this is actually to alleviate the coordination under the vice president guidelines. So we do research, we do piloting, we do some experiment. We work with many colleagues from the US, from the Europe, including Abhijit Banerjee, Penolkan, Rimahana, and we produce a lot of interesting research that then we policy implementation. Next. So this is my last slide. The lesson that we can learn, not exactly about measurement, Professor Foster, but I'm very supportive and I'm happy to, continue working on this one with Center of Statistics and also with Pak Bambang Projo to, endorse this in the future, making it more compact, to be complementary to our consumption-based measure of poverty. I think that's definitely complementary. We cannot use one of them, but we have to use both in the future. So in terms of the lesson learned from the social protection, I think that social protection is indeed, help the poor to cope with the shock and also have a long-term, can break the intergenerational poverty in the future. This is especially on the program like conditional cash transfer. This is again based on the work that we have done. I have done with Pak Ilan Satriawan, with Abhijit Banerjee. We, written many papers with him. Before he got Nobel, he got all the money, which is great because he's very smart. And also with Penolkan and also Rimahana. And then with regard to targeting, I mentioned that formal targeting is important, using like PMT or machine learning algorithm, but community also play a role in identifying the extreme poor especially. And then we also learned that transferring rice, in kind to vouchers actually can improve the effectiveness of the program. And then another lesson that we had is actually providing tangible information from the poor actually help improve the program targeting, because if they know what they are entitled to, let's say I receive 10 kilos of rice every month, and then if I didn't receive what I'm supposed to be getting it, we can go protest to the head of the village and demanding for the better quality. And lastly, Mbak, it's about the COVID. I think this was also discussed with Pak Bambang and Pak Khatib Basri. I'm not going to repeat that, but I think we need to have more, social registry in them, so that we can have more data. When the shock comes, we already know who should be helped by the government or by other people, because Indonesia doesn't have information on the tax. It's only about 11-12%, Pak Bambang, so the rest is using proxy. Other country, it's very easy if you live in Australia. If you got shocked and then suddenly you receive a check in your bank account, $1,000, because they know exactly how much money do you earn. It's the same thing in the US, in Europe, Indonesia, we don't have any information whatsoever. So you can call it middle class, you can call it the poor, but who are they? Do you have any name and address of those people so that you can give assistance? Money, food is a normal good, Professor Foster taught me all along. And normal good, more is always better. Even if you are not that poor, if you are getting assistance, I think you will receive it. You are not going to reject that one. So again, thank you so much, Professor Foster, for your presentation, and also we will continue talking about this one with Asep and Pak Ilan as the task force of this task force forward to discuss more about this multidimensional poverty measure in the future for the use of Indonesia. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Pak Darno. Now we come to the QA session. We have here from the participant online. From all of us here, you can raise your hand as well if you have question or a comment for the panelists. From the online participants, we have 3 questions here. Diko, a student from Wageningen University. I think the question directed to you, Professor Foster. In the example is, regarding the cutoff in MPI that you explain in the example is equal to 2, but in the real practice, how much dimension the people deem poor? If we choose 3K, is it also possible if 2 dimensions are enough to maybe deem people poor? In the consumption-based poverty, the cutoff is clear because, it is based on the required basic needs. But MPI, how are we sure much dimension are sufficient to judge someone to be poor? Thank you. And maybe I continue with the next question to Pak Bambang. Pak Bambang, you mentioned how the MPI is important for the government, but why to this day the government is yet to adopt the MPI for data-driven policy making? This is from Raka from Depok. Pak Darno, maybe you can also share your insight. For the third question here, how far can government do in developing MPI, since MPI problem is more with population data collection, and how each individual is included in the data set? Does this mean that in the future there will be development in surveys or data collection? Thank you. Maybe first, Professor Foster. If you would like to comment on the question.
Great. Well, first, let me clear something up. Consumption and monetary poverty lines are not that clear. $1 a day for the World Bank, now $1.90, randomly chosen by Kaushik Basu. It's random. They're arbitrary. They will always be. Anytime you choose one number, it could have been another number. Recognize that and understand we're always going to choose something arbitrarily. We try to guide it with the data. That helps us. But once it's been purchased, once it's been created, it is just a number. It's a number in the US that's been there for how many years? Since 1960. Never changed. So it isn't so clear. But I take your question. I understand that K, or the cutoff in poverty, in multidimensional poverty, may take some thinking about. But it's interesting how people start understanding it. Everyday people can see what it means to be poor. They look at the people who are identified and they say, yes, that's true, or no, that isn't true. Now, I'm not going to say that my example reflects reality. It doesn't. It is just an example. Whether I go to 3 or 2 was what was convenient for me at the moment, because I was trying to teach as opposed to set policy. But many, many, many countries are going through this exercise with their committees, with people who talk to the citizens, and there are senses of what's going on in terms of who is it that's poor, being more reflected, better reflected by MPI. So it's being put together. I don't have the solution. I shouldn't have the solution. It would be imposed by other people if I had the solution. No, it should be imposed by the people themselves. As far as the other questions, you know, I'm going to let you continue and let the experts respond. Please.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let me try to respond to the second question. Why government so far hasn't really utilized the MPI, especially for policy formulation related to the poverty alleviation? I would say that yes, it's not really utilized directly, but I believe indirectly, in my experience in the national development planning, we already pay attention to several indicators that's part of the MPI. For example, we always monitor and analyze the data on years of schooling, and then water, basic infrastructure, the sanitation, as well as nutrition, and also child mortality. And even we have some additional indicators that are very relevant to Indonesia. But what I'm trying to say is that the MPI concept as a whole hasn't been really kind of the foundation, you know, to develop the policy for poverty. And the reason is because, of course, talking about poverty from political perspective is very sensitive, because, you know, every opposition like to hit you whenever you have some glitch on the poverty data that release every 6 months. So that's why government prefers to use the existing information about poverty, but and didn't touch so far about MPI to the public, at least. But my suggestion is that, of course, MPI might be too sensitive to be publicized, although that could be wrong, but at least MPI will be very useful as a foundation for poverty reduction policy formulation, because you can touch several indicators that so far in Indonesia, for example, is still a bit behind. For example, my examples of water, sanitation, you know, that's never been a headline whenever you are talking about infrastructure. And also, you can talk more about nutrition, which is not also headline when you are talking about health issue in Indonesia. So I guess if we use the MPI, then we can highlight and we can increase the priority and importance of priority on several issues. I think that will be my response. Yeah.
Thank you, Pak Bambang. Going to Pak Darno. There is also an additional question here. To what extent TNP2K might encourage government in using MPI for social protection?
Okay, the first question is actually on the first in terms of the data collection. I think Central Bureau, I used to be the chair of the Statistical Community Forum when Pak Bambang was the Minister of Bapenas, which actually not overseeing directly, but actually having a very recent discussion with the Central Bureau of Statistics in terms of improving the quality of data collection. I believe that Central Bureau of Statistics has already started also with working with Professor Sabina of constructing this MPI index, but they didn't release it. I'm also going to have a look and study with them in terms of, what can we make use of that one. There are still some missing component of it, and I think we definitely need to make some adjustment in terms of, what kind of the indicators. Again, that, I'm with Professor Foster in terms of, the methodology and also, the way how he constructed the index, and also his critics, not his critic, in his comment about even the 1, 9 or 2 point dollar also arbitrary. We can discuss, but they have already been discussed for quite some time. So I think it's more focused on that one. As with actually the Pak Elan maybe can also respond to that question in terms of the national theme. Actually, the way we use targeting mechanic algorithm has also been indirectly constructed that index. For example, when we have to select, among Steel Minister, 100 districts in Indonesia with the highest stunting, actually we use similar to the MPI index, equal weight, several indicators that we put it in there, but this is our unit of analysis is actually district, not, and then we can rank that out of this 500 thing. But in terms of the formality of adopting it, I think definitely Bappenas can take a lead with the PPS, and we can start looking at the details about what component need to be included in the MPI, and also the problem is actually because this is something that people are afraid of using it. Probably I don't know about Bambang, is because they would always like to see this in parallel direction. When headcount, consumption-based measure fall, and then they also expect the MPI will also fall, but not necessarily. It depends on which component, and will you accept to that reality in the future? This is something that we have to be aware of as a policymakers in the future. So while the simple thing about the consumption-based measure is because 2100 kilocalorie per day, and the price of calorie, even that is also complicated. Professor Foster also criticized this. It's also multidimensional, even if you're using consumption, but they are additive because it's money metric, right? Well, we can discuss about that. And so I think that's the issue that we need to discuss. I don't have the answer right now, but Pak Bambang here is a head of the task force, and he has all of the influence on the policymaker in the government, and we definitely need to bring this up into more of open debate, because one of the key elements that Professor Foster mentioned about MPI is this transparency. I think that can bring into the work. Consumption is only, not many people can calculate about, except Pak Elan and Pak Asep here, who is using a lot of consumption-based measure of poverty. But MPI probably is very transparent, because the width, the component, the formula, and you can do the same thing like the severity. Gitu, Mbak.
Okay. Thank you, Pak Darno, Professor Foster, and Prof. Bambang Brojonegoro. And before we end the session, I think we have gained insight from Prof. Bambang, how it can actually elevate the concept of MPI in domestic policies, local, and also on the context of T20 recommendation task force 5. And Professor Foster, thank you for the course. And I'm learning very much from your presentations and explanation. And Pak Darno, thank you again. Nice also learning how is actually TNP2K committed, and how government of Indonesia can respond quite fast, I think, with the support as well, with various from the research and evidence-based policies in this context. Thank you to all of us here, and we end this session. The next will be parallel session. Before that, we have the coffee break. Please give applause to our panelists here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I just realized that I've been out of academia too long.
Thank you, Professor James.
My pleasure.